In the early hours of August 23, 1689, in the port city of Charleston, South Carolina, the most harrowing screams ever heard in the Carolina colony pierced the humid southern air. 4 bodies writhed in agony as boiling oil melted their skin, applied by the hands of a woman who had lost everything she loved. Sarah of Charleston, a 28-year-old West African slave, had executed the most meticulous and brutal revenge ever documented in colonial America. In a single night, she turned her tormentors into victims of their own cruelty. This is the story of how maternal grief transformed into avenging fury, and how one woman proved that justice must sometimes be taken into one's own hands. Subscribe now to discover how an enslaved mother executed the most calculated and bloody revenge of the colonial era. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. In 1689, the city of Charleston was the most important slave market of the British Empire in the Americas. Its brick walls protected not only rice and indigo bound for England, but also the continent's most lucrative human flesh market. Each month, between 800 and 1,200 Africans arrived in chains on slave ships, to be sold as beasts of burden. At the heart of this slave city lived Colonel Jonathan Whitmore, a slave trader and owner of the port's most prosperous trading house. His residence, located in the Battery District, was a 3-story brick fortress that housed not only his family but also 47 domestic slaves, who served under conditions of extreme brutality. Among these slaves was Sarah, a 28-year-old West African woman who had arrived in Charleston in 1681 aboard the slave ship Mary Catherine. Her original name was Amara, a minor princess of a kingdom in present-day Ghana, captured during a tribal war and sold to English traffickers for the equivalent of 150 pounds sterling. Sarah had become the primary domestic slave in the Whitmore household, responsible for overseeing the kitchen, child care, and internal administration. Her exceptional intelligence and ability to quickly learn English had made her indispensable to the family, but also an object of dangerous trust. Colonel Whitmore had 3 sons, Thomas, 24, William, 19, and Edward, 16. All 3 had inherited not only their father's wealth but also his absolute contempt for Africans. For them, slaves were talking commodities, objects of amusement and outlets for their basest instincts. Thomas, the eldest son, abused his position the most. He had made the rape of slaves a regular pastime, considering it a natural right of his social position. His cruelty knew no bounds. He beat slaves with iron canes, branded them with hot irons for fun, and organized betting competitions with his brothers on how many lashes each victim could withstand. William had developed a particular obsession with psychological torture. He separated mothers from their young children, selling the children to other families just to observe maternal suffering. "Black women must learn that they have no right to love," he would say as he watched the tears of desperate mothers. Edward, the youngest, compensated for his youth with cruelty that surpassed that of his older brothers. He had invented macabre games, forced slaves to fight each other to the death, burned their personal belongings before their eyes, and slowly tortured the weakest with instruments he designed himself. But it was in 1687 that Sarah underwent the transformation that would make her the most feared avenger in colonial America. That year she had given birth to twin sons, Kwame and Kofi, the fruit of a rape by Thomas Whitmore. Despite the horror of their conception, Sarah loved those children with an intensity that transcended the pain of their origins. The twins became the only light in the hell of the Whitmore household. Sarah secretly taught them words in their native language, told them stories of her kingdom in Africa, and dreamed of the day they could be free. For 2 years, she managed to keep them relatively protected, working double shifts so they wouldn't be assigned to hard labor. The Whitmore household functioned like a perfectly organized hell. On the first floor were the commercial offices where slave sales were negotiated. The second floor housed the family rooms decorated with luxuries purchased with African blood. The third floor and the basements were the dungeons where newly arrived slaves were stored before being sold. Colonel Whitmore had turned the buying and selling of human beings into an exact science. He knew the market value of each type of slave. West Africans were preferred for domestic work because of their intelligence, Central Africans for heavy labor because of their physical strength, and those from the Gold Coast for specialized trades because of their artisanal skills. The slaves' food consisted of kitchen scraps mixed with rotten cornmeal. They slept crammed into unventilated rooms, chained together to prevent nighttime escapes. Diseases spread rapidly. Tuberculosis, dysentery, and tropical infections that Colonel Whitmore considered natural casualties of the business. Sarah had developed a survival system based on meticulous observation. For 8 years, she had memorized every routine, every weakness, every secret of the Whitmore family. She knew exactly when and how each family member was most vulnerable. This information would become the foundation of her perfect revenge. At night, when the family slept, Sarah mentally planned different escape scenarios with her children, but she knew that any failed attempt would result not only in her death, but in the torture of Kwame and Kofi before her eyes. This reality kept her silent for years, accumulating hatred like gunpowder, waiting for the right spark. Sarah has survived 8 years in hell, but something is about to change forever. Be ready to discover the event that will transform a loving mother into the most ruthless avenger of the colonial era. On August 20, 1689, a Tuesday that Sarah would remember until her last breath, the event occurred that would forever transform her soul and seal the fate of the Whitmore family. It was the hottest time of year in Charleston, when the southern humidity turned the city into a steaming cauldron and tempers ran high to dangerous levels. Twins Kwame and Kofi, now 2 years old, had begun to walk and explore the house with the natural curiosity of their age. That morning, while Sarah was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, the children slipped into the main courtyard, where Thomas, William, and Edward Whitmore were arguing about the sale of a batch of slaves recently arrived from Africa. The little ones, attracted by the voices, innocently approached the brothers. Kwame, the more adventurous of the two, picked up a piece of fruit that had fallen near Thomas's feet. This simple, childish act would trigger a tragedy that would change the course of colonial history in Charleston. "Damn black thief," Thomas roared when he saw the boy put the fruit in his mouth. "These animals need to be taught from a young age who's in charge." Without a second thought, he lifted his boot and brutally kicked little Kwame in the stomach, sending him several meters into the air. The boy landed violently against a stone column. The sound of the impact echoed throughout the courtyard. Kofi ran to his crying twin brother, trying to help him, but William lifted him by the hair. "You want to learn too, you fucking black boy," he yelled before slamming him into the stone floor with brutal force. Sarah came running when she heard the screams, but it was too late. Kwame lay motionless, with blood pouring from his mouth and nose, while Kofi convulsed with an open wound on his head. "My children, my babies," she cried desperately, throwing herself to the ground to hug them. "Shut up, bitch," Edward snapped as he kicked her in the ribs. "These animals are receiving their first lesson in obedience. You should thank us for training your youngsters properly." Colonel Whitmore appeared, attracted by the commotion. Seeing the scene, he showed no compassion for the dying children, but rather irritation at the interruption of his business. "What does this scandal mean? I have buyers waiting and you're making a circus over 2 black children." "The puppies were stealing food, Father," Thomas explained, wiping his hands as if he had touched something dirty. "I was teaching them that theft comes at a high price, even if they are young." Colonel Whitmore observed the dying children without the slightest emotion. "Well done. They must be trained from a young age, or they grow up believing they have rights." Then he turned to Sarah with absolute coldness. "Clean up this mess and get back to your work. If these 2 are no longer good for anything, I'll sell them to feed pigs." The next 3 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. She carried her dying children to the slave quarters, where she desperately tried to save their lives with home remedies she had learned from her grandmother in Africa. But the internal injuries were too severe for her limited medical knowledge. Kwame died first, at 2:30 p.m., barely 2 years old. His last words were "Mama," a whisper that took Sarah's soul with it. Kofi endured until 4:45 p.m., clinging to his mother's hand before exhaling his last breath, his eyes fixed on hers. At that moment, something broke irreparably in Sarah's heart. The maternal pain transformed into a fury that transcended humanity. The tears dried in her eyes and were replaced by a blood-curdling coldness. The woman who had been Amara, princess of Ghana, had awakened thirsting for revenge. That night, Sarah carried her children's tiny bodies to the backyard, where she dug their graves with her own bloody hands. As she buried Kwame and Kofi under the moonlight, she swore an oath in her native language that would resonate in her soul forever. By the blood of my children, by the pain in my womb, I swear that every drop of my baby's blood will be paid for with rivers of their murderer's blood. For the next 3 days, Sarah continued working in the house as if nothing had happened. But the other slaves noticed the change. Her eyes had turned to ice, her movements calculated, her silence absolute. She had begun to observe the Whitmore family with the precision of a predator studying its prey. The transformation was complete. The loving mother had died along with her children. What remained was an avenger who knew every secret, every routine, every weakness of those who had taken away everything she held dear in the world. The Whitmore brothers, completely oblivious to the danger brewing in silence, continued their lives of cruelty and excess, unaware that they had awakened the deadliest fury that would ever walk the streets of Charleston. Pain had become a deadly weapon. Sarah had begun to plan a revenge that would be remembered for centuries. Are you ready to learn how a devastated mother became the most dangerous strategist in colonial America? During the 2 weeks following the death of her children, Sarah transformed into a silent shadow, observing, memorizing, and planning with the precision of a general preparing for the most important battle of her life. Her grief had turned into calculating coldness, and her maternal love into a thirst for meticulous revenge. The other slaves in the Whitmore household noticed the radical change in Sarah's patience. A 45-year-old woman from the Gold Coast, who had been her confidant for years, tried to approach her and comfort her. "Sister, I know the pain is killing you inside, but you must keep living," she whispered to her during one early morning while they worked in the kitchen. Sarah looked at her with eyes that no longer reflected human life. "I died 2 weeks ago," she answered, in a voice that chilled the soul. "What you see here is only the instrument of the justice my children deserve. Don't try to stop me, because there's no turning back now." Over the next few days, Sarah developed a plan of revenge that surpassed in complexity and cruelty anything documented in the colonial archives. It would not be an explosion of uncontrolled rage, but a perfect execution that would ensure that every member of the Whitmore family would experience exactly the same suffering they had inflicted for years. Her first advantage was her intimate knowledge of the house and the family routine. For 8 years, she had observed every movement, every habit, every moment of vulnerability. She knew that Colonel Whitmore reviewed the accounting books every Tuesday night in his private study, completely alone. She knew that Thomas had the habit of bathing in the backyard every Thursday at dawn. She had memorized that William and Edward played cards in the main room every Saturday after dinner. Her second advantage was the trust the family had placed in her over the years. As the primary domestic slave, she had unrestricted access to every room, knew the location of weapons, the keys to cupboards, and, most importantly, completely controlled the preparation of all food and beverages in the house. Sarah began to discreetly acquire the necessary elements for her revenge. During her visits to the market to buy provisions, she stole small quantities of poisonous herbs she had known since her childhood in Africa. She also began stockpiling extra cooking oil, pretending it was for preparing special fried foods she had promised the family. But the most ingenious part of her plan was the psychological component. Sarah had decided that the Whitmores would not die quickly like her children. They would experience terror, prolonged pain, and the despair of knowing their death was inevitable, but slow. Each would die in a way that accurately reflected the cruelty they had shown to slaves. For Colonel Whitmore, who had reduced human lives to numbers on ledgers, Sarah planned a death by slowly poured boiling oil like the molten gold he so loved to count. For Thomas, who had raped dozens of slave women, she reserved a prior castration before death by burning. For William, who enjoyed separating families, he would die watching her torture his brothers before receiving his own punishment. For Edward, the youngest and cruelest, she had planned the slowest and most painful death. Sarah had also identified the perfect moment to execute her plan. On Saturday, August 23rd, when the family would celebrate Colonel Whitmore's 50th birthday, everyone would be gathered at the house, relaxed from the celebration, and with their immune systems weakened by the alcohol they would consume during the party. During those 2 weeks of preparation, Sarah acquired skills she had never imagined she possessed. She learned to move around the house in complete silence, to open locks without making a sound, and to prepare herbal mixtures that could numb or paralyze without causing immediate death. Her natural intelligence, enhanced by fury and pain, had turned her into a perfect assassin. The most observant slaves began to notice subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She worked with mechanical efficiency, but her eyes constantly calculated distances, times, and opportunities. Some suspected she was planning an escape. Others feared she had gone mad with grief. None imagined the true magnitude of what was brewing in her mind. The irony was perfect. The same Whitmores who had destroyed her capacity for love had inadvertently awakened a strategic intelligence that was now turned against them. The domestic slave they trusted for their food, their safety, and their daily comfort had become the deadliest danger that had ever set foot in their home. On Friday, August 22, Sarah made final preparations. She hid the containers of extra oil in strategic locations around the house. She verified that the paralyzing herbs were properly prepared and mentally reviewed each step of her plan once more. There would be no room for error or mercy. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, Sarah visited the graves of Kwame and Kofi. She knelt before the small mounds of earth and whispered in her African tongue, "Tomorrow, my beloved children, the blood debt will begin to be paid. Your murderers will know the same pain you felt, but multiplied by 1,000. The perfect plan has been laid. Sarah is ready to execute the most brutal revenge ever documented in the Americas. Are you prepared to learn how a mother-turned-avenger executed the bloodiest justice of the colonial era?" Saturday, August 23, 1689. The day had arrived. The Whitmore household was preparing to celebrate Colonel Whitmore's 50th birthday with a party that would bring together the entire family and a few chosen guests from Charleston's high society. Sarah rose before dawn, as she had for 8 years, but this time she knew it would be the last time she would wake up as a slave. The preparation of the banquet provided the perfect cover for the final preparations for her revenge. While cooking the family favorites, Sarah discreetly incorporated the paralyzing herbs she had prepared for weeks. Not enough to kill, but just enough to weaken their reflexes and ability to resist. When the crucial moment arrived, Colonel Whitmore woke up in excellent spirits, completely unaware that he was living his last hours. During breakfast, Sarah watched him slowly chew the jam-smeared bread containing the first sedative. "Sarah, this bread is delicious," he commented, unaware that each bite brought him closer to his fate. "Prepare more for dinner tonight." "Of course, master," Sarah replied with a perfect curtsy, while mentally calculating that the sedative would take effect in approximately 6 hours, just as the evening celebration would begin. During the day, the other guests arrived, 3 slave trading associates of Colonel Whitmore, their wives, and some colonial officials. Sarah served appetizers that also contained carefully calculated doses of her paralyzing mixtures. Each person would receive exactly the amount needed based on their body weight, a calculation she had perfected over years by observing how different amounts of alcohol affected each member of the family. The Whitmore brothers arrived at dusk, displaying the arrogance Sarah had learned to hate with every fiber of her being. Thomas had just come from raping a recently purchased slave in the port markets. William carried with him bills of sale separating 3 African families, laughing at the tears of mothers losing their children. Edward had spent the afternoon torturing an elderly slave who had dared to ask for extra water during the workday. "Sarah, serve wine," Colonel Whitmore ordered when all the guests were seated around the large table in the main dining room. "Today marks 50 years of success in the most prosperous business in the colonies." Sarah personally poured each glass of wine, ensuring that the members of the Whitmore family received the most generous portions of the adulterated concoction. As she filled Thomas's glass, their eyes met for a moment. He, already completely drunk from the previous alcohol, winked at her lasciviously. "After the party, black girl, come to my room. Today we celebrate in style." "It will be an honor, Master Thomas," Sarah replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Inwardly, she savored the irony. It would be she who would visit his room, but not for what he imagined. Dinner passed between laughter, toasts, and conversations about the prices of black cattle in the Atlantic markets. The guests praised the dish prepared by Sarah, little suspecting that each bite sealed their fate. Colonel Whitmore proposed a toast to 50 more years of prosperity built on the labor of these African animals. At 10:30 p.m., the effects of the herbs began to manifest subtly. The guests felt more relaxed than usual, attributing the sensation to the excellent wine. Their reflexes slowed imperceptibly. Their muscles gradually lost tension, but their consciousness remained intact. It was exactly what Sarah had planned. When the outside guests retired to their guest rooms around midnight, Sarah knew her moment had arrived. The Whitmore family remained in the dining room, drinking and laughing, completely vulnerable and unaware that their house slave had become their executioner. Sarah excused herself to clean the kitchen, but in reality, she went to prepare the final instruments of her revenge. In the kitchen, she had prepared 4 large vats of cooking oil that had been slowly heating for hours to temperatures that could melt human flesh in seconds. She had also arranged rope, sharp knives, and the branding irons the family used to identify their slaves. Tonight, those instruments of torture would turn against their creators with a poetic justice that Sarah mentally savored. From the kitchen, she could hear the Whitmore brothers' increasingly slurred voices. The herbs were taking perfect effect. Their victims remained conscious enough to fully experience their suffering, but physically unable to effectively resist. At 1:15 a.m., Sarah carried the first container of boiling oil and headed toward the dining room. Her movements were as silent as a ghost's. Her eyes shone with a determination that transcended humanity. After 2 weeks of perfect planning, the time had come to collect the blood debt. The submissive slave was gone forever. What walked the halls of the Whitmore house was the embodiment of the purest and most lethal maternal vengeance ever to set foot on American soil. Revenge is about to begin. Sarah has prepared everything to perfection. Do you have the courage to learn how she executed the most brutal justice ever documented in the colonial era? 1:20 a.m. on August 24, 1689. Sarah entered the dining room carrying the first container of boiling oil, moving with the silent precision of death personified. The 4 members of the Whitmore family remained seated around the table, their movements clumsy from the paralyzing herbs, but fully aware of what was about to happen. "Sarah, what are you doing awake at this hour?" Colonel Whitmore asked in a thick voice, trying to focus his gaze on the figure approaching with calculated steps. "And what are you carrying in that container?" Sarah didn't respond immediately. She stopped 3 meters from the table, placed the steaming container on the floor, and for the first time in 8 years looked directly into her master's eyes without lowering her head in submission. When she spoke, her voice had a coldness that chilled the blood. "I bring justice, Colonel Whitmore. The same justice you gave my children 2 weeks ago when you slaughtered them like animals for the crime of being starving children." The silence that followed was absolute. The 4 men instantly understood that their world had changed forever. The submissive slave girl was gone, replaced by something beyond their worst nightmares. "Have you gone mad, you black bitch?" roared Thomas, trying to stand but finding his legs wouldn't fully obey him. "I'm going to kill you for your insolence." "No, Thomas," replied Sarah with a smile that contained no trace of humanity. "The one who's going to die is you, but not quickly like my babies died. You're going to suffer every second like they suffered, multiplied by 1,000. Sarah had planned to start with Edward, the youngest, so that the other 3 would experience the terror of seeing what awaited them. She approached the 16-year-old boy, who was desperately trying to get up from his chair, but found his muscles barely responding. "Please, Sarah," Edward pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't kill your children. It was an accident. I don't deserve to die for that." Sarah looked at him with absolute contempt. "An accident? I saw you laugh while my babies were dying. I saw you tell them they were animals who deserved to die." She tied his hands to the chair with ropes she had prepared. "Now, you're going to learn what it feels like to be treated like an animal." She took the first container of boiling oil and with deliberately slow movements to maximize psychological terror, began pouring it over Edward's feet. The screams that followed were heard throughout the Battery district. awakening neighbors who would never forget that night of horror. "Stop! Stop, please!" Edward shouted as the oil melted his skin and muscles. "Forgive me, I'll do whatever you want." My children screamed too, Sarah responded without showing any emotion, continuing to pour oil over the boy's legs. "But you didn't stop." "Why would I stop?" Colonel Whitmore and his two other sons watched in horror, futilely trying to move to help Edward. The paralyzing herbs kept them as forced spectators of a revenge they knew was only the beginning. "Sarah, stop," Colonel Whitmore roared. "I'll give you freedom, I'll give you gold, anything you want." Sarah turned on him with eyes that no longer reflected any humanity. "Freedom? Gold? My sons are dead, Colonel Whitmore. There is no gold in the world that can bring them back, but there is justice, and tonight it will be fully served." Edward lost consciousness after 10 minutes of torture with boiling oil. Sarah checked that he was still breathing before turning to William, who was shaking uncontrollably in his chair. "Your younger brother died a relatively quick death," she told him as she prepared the second container of oil. "But you, William, who specialized in separating families, are going to suffer much longer." William's torture lasted 30 minutes. Sarah applied the oil in small amounts, alternating with periods of rest so the pain would intensify. Between screams of agony, William begged for mercy, promised to free all the slaves, vowed to turn his life around. But Sarah remained impassive, recalling every family he had destroyed with his sails. "Each drop of oil represents a tear from the mothers you separated from their children," she explained as she worked meticulously. "And since there are many tears to be collected, this will take time." Colonel Whitmore and Thomas watched, petrified, as their son and brother was slowly executed before their eyes. The reality of their situation was absolutely clear. They were completely helpless against a revenge they had earned with years of extreme cruelty. When William finally lost consciousness, Sarah turned to Thomas. This was the moment she had most anticipated during 2 weeks of planning. The man who had raped her and then murdered the resulting children would receive the most elaborate and painful death. "Thomas, my dear rapist," she said, in a soft voice that contrasted starkly with her actions. "You were the one who started all this when you raped me 3 years ago, and you were the one who ended it all when you killed my babies. That's why your death will be the most educational." Thomas's screams echoed throughout Charleston for over an hour, mingling with the wails of his dying brothers and creating a symphony of horror that forever marked the city's collective memory. 3 of the 4 Whitmores have received their punishment, but Colonel Whitmore, the patriarch responsible for the entire system of cruelty, still awaits his turn. Are you ready to learn how Sarah reserved the most terrible death for last? When Thomas's screams finally ceased, leaving only an agonized wail fading into the Charleston dawn, Sarah turned to Colonel Jonathan Whitmore, the 50-year-old patriarch who for decades had built his fortune on the suffering of thousands of Africans, now faced the final reckoning for his crimes. Colonel Whitmore had witnessed the systematic torture of his 3 sons for 4 hours. The paralyzing herbs had rendered him unable to move, but his mind remained fully lucid to experience every second of the horror. Silent tears streamed down his face as he watched the woman he had considered mere property become the embodiment of divine justice. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking, "you already had your revenge. My children are either dead or dying. Isn't this pain enough to satisfy your thirst?" Sarah approached slowly, carrying the largest container of boiling oil she had prepared especially for him. Her movements were calculated, ceremonial, as if she were performing a sacred ritual she had waited years for. "Enough," she repeated with a soul-chilling smile. "Colonel Whitmore, you have bought, sold, tortured, and murdered more than 1,000 Africans during your career. You have separated families, raped women, branded children with hot irons, and turned human suffering into your most prosperous business. Do you really think the deaths of 3 people can pay such an immense debt?" She stopped in front of him, holding the steaming container at eye level. "But you are right about one thing. This is not just personal revenge for my children. This is cosmic justice for every African soul you have destroyed during 30 years of the slave trade." Sarah began the most sinister interrogation ever documented in colonial archives. For the next 30 minutes, she forced Colonel Whitmore to publicly confess to each of his crimes while applying boiling oil drop by drop to different parts of his body. "Confess," she ordered, pouring oil over his right hand. "How many African women did you personally rape before selling them?" "I don't know, maybe 50, 60, he screamed as his flesh melted. "They were just merchandise, they meant nothing." "Each one had a name, a family, dreams," Sarah replied, applying more oil. "Like me, like my children that you allowed to be killed." She continued with the next question. How many children did you take from their mothers to sell individually?" "Hundreds, thousands." "It was business," Colonel Whitmore pleaded. "Children were worth more separately. It was business logic." "It was systematized cruelty," Sarah corrected, pouring oil over his left arm. "Every child you sold screamed for its mother, like my babies screamed when your children killed them." The process continued for an hour. Sarah extracted detailed confessions about the murders of rebellious slaves, public torture as an example, and the web of corruption that Colonel Whitmore had built with colonial officials to keep his business running without legal oversight. But the most shocking revelation came when Sarah asked about the accounting books she had seen for years in the study. "What do those entries about losses due to natural deterioration mean?" "They were the ones who died on the ships," Colonel Whitmore confessed between screams of agony. "We estimated a 30% mortality rate during the voyage. We threw them into the sea as useless ballast." "How many?" Sarah insisted, applying oil to his chest. "How many human beings did you throw into the ocean as garbage?" "In 30 years, perhaps 3,000, 4,000, he roared. "But it was normal. All slavers did it. It was part of the business." Sarah paused for a moment, processing the magnitude of the confession. 4,000 people killed during the transports alone, not counting the victims of subsequent slavery. Her personal revenge had become something much larger. The reckoning of an entire system of dehumanization. "Colonel Whitmore," she told him in a voice that now held a religious solemnity, "you are not just a cruel man. You are the personification of the purest evil that exists. That is why your death will not only be punishment, but an exorcism." What followed surpassed in horror anything that had come before. Sarah had reserved for Colonel Whitmore a torture that combined boiling oil with the same branding irons he had used for decades to identify his slaves. But now the symbols she carved into his flesh were not letters of ownership, but African words meaning murderer, child thief, and demon. Colonel Whitmore's agony lasted until dawn. His screams awakened the entire Battery District, but no neighbor dared to intervene. Some thought it was a party that had gotten out of hand. Others suspected the truth but preferred not to get involved in the affairs of rebellious slaves. As the sun began to illuminate the streets of Charleston, Colonel Jonathan Whitmore breathed his last. His eyes, once filled with arrogance, now reflected the absolute terror of one who had seen the true face of divine justice. Sarah observed the 4 bodies for several minutes, feeling, for the first time in weeks, something resembling peace. The blood debt of her sons had been paid, but more importantly, she had sent a message that would resonate throughout colonial America. The slaves were no longer passive victims, but human beings capable of taking justice into their own hands. The revenge has been completed, but Sarah's story has only just begun. How will she escape Charleston after enacting the most brutal revenge of the colonial era? The next chapter will reveal her ultimate fate. With the first light of dawn illuminating the 4 tortured bodies in the dining room of the Whitmore house, Sarah knew she had only hours before the colonial authorities discovered the massacre and launched a manhunt unprecedented in the history of Charleston. But Sarah hadn't just planned the perfect revenge. She had also engineered the most audacious escape ever executed by a rebellious slave on American soil. For 2 weeks, while preparing the Whitmore's death, she had simultaneously built a support network that would take her from the streets of Charleston to absolute freedom. Her first move was to quietly awaken the other slaves in the house. Patience, the woman from the Gold Coast who had been her confidant, was the first to see the scene in the dining room. Her reaction wasn't one of horror, but of deep satisfaction and respect for Sarah. "Sister," she whispered to her as she looked down at the bodies, You've done what we've all dreamed of for years, but never had the courage to attempt. Now you're free, but you're also the most wanted woman in the British Empire. How do you plan to escape?" Sarah smiled for the first time in weeks, a smile that no longer contained pain, but pure determination. "Patience. For 8 years, I listened to all of Colonel Whitmore's business conversations. I know the slave ship routes, the contacts in other ports, and the corrupt officials who facilitated the trafficking. That information is now my ticket to freedom." She had identified 3 escape options. The first was Maritime, a French pirate ship commanded by Jean-Baptiste Ducasse, who had done illegal business with Colonel Whitmore and was well aware of the corruption in the Charleston port. The second was land-based, a network of maroon communities, settlements of runaway slaves, that stretched from the Carolina mountains to the Florida swamps. The third and most audacious option was to infiltrate a ship sailing for Africa, completing the circle of her life. Sarah chose the first option. During her years as a domestic slave, she had memorized the secret codes Colonel Whitmore used to communicate with pirates and smugglers. She knew exactly how to contact Ducasse and had information valuable enough to buy her passage to freedom. Before leaving, Sarah freed all the slaves in the Whitmore household. She gave them the keys to the warehouses, showed them where Colonel Whitmore kept the emergency gold, and provided them with forged documents she had spent weeks preparing. "Brothers and sisters," she told them, "you have 2 choices. Flee now to the maroon communities in the mountains, or stay and face the vengeance of the authorities. I recommend that you run." 46 slaves chose immediate freedom. Only one, an old man named Joshua, who had lost hope after 30 years of slavery, decided to stay and face the consequences. "Daughter," he said to Sarah, "I don't have enough strength to run, but I have lived long enough to see true justice. I will die in peace, knowing that the demons have been punished." At 6:30 in the morning, Sarah left the Whitmore house for the last time. She was wearing a lady's dress she had stolen from the closet of Colonel Whitmore's late wife, forged documents identifying her as Miss Sarah of Ghana, a free trader, and a bag containing enough stolen gold to finance her new life. Her first destination was the port, where she knew Ducasse's ship would be docked at Wharf 3. The French pirate was known for his pragmatism. It didn't matter to him whether Sarah was a runaway slave or a serial murderer, as long as she had something valuable to offer in exchange for transportation. The conversation with Ducasse was brief and to the point. "Captain," Sarah told him in the basic French she had learned from listening to trade conversations, "I have information on the routes of the English merchant ships, the schedules of naval patrols, and the names of all the corrupt port officials. In exchange, I need passage to St. Domingue." Ducasse, a 45-year-old man with scars from naval battles etched on his weathered face, assessed Sarah with the eyes of a military strategist. "Woman, you just left a house where 4 people died this morning. The English soldiers are already looking for you. Why should I risk my ship for you?" "Because," Sarah replied with the coldness she had developed over weeks, "that information I possess is worth more than all the ships you've plundered in your career, and because I'm the only person alive who knows all the secrets of the slave trade in this port." The negotiation lasted 30 minutes. In the end, Ducasse accepted the deal, impressed not only by the information Sarah possessed, but by the strategic intelligence she demonstrated. "Madame," he said, as he ordered the ship to be prepared for immediate departure, "you are no ordinary slave. You are a war general who has just won her first battle." At 8:45 in the morning, when the colonial authorities finally discovered the massacre at the Whitmore house, Ducasse's ship had already set sail for international waters, carrying Sarah toward her new life as a free woman. The last memory Sarah had of Charleston were the church spires disappearing over the horizon. She felt neither nostalgia nor sadness, only the profound satisfaction of having collected the most important blood debt of her life. From the pirate ship, while the Atlantic wind moved her hair free for the first time in years, Sarah whispered a prayer in her African tongue addressed to the souls of Kwame and Kofi. "My children, revenge has been completed. Your deaths have been paid for with the blood of demons. Now Mama will be free to honor your memory by building a new life." Sarah has escaped Charleston, but her story is far from over. What will await her in her new life as a free woman? The final chapter will reveal the legendary destiny of the most famous Avenger in the Americas. Jean-Baptiste Ducasse's ship arrived in Port-au-Prince, Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, on September 2, 1689, 10 days after the Charleston massacre. Sarah disembarked at the port not as a runaway slave, but as a free woman with perfect forged documents, enough gold to start a new life, and a reputation that preceded her as the Caribbean's most feared avenger. Saint-Domingue in 1689 was a unique territory in the Americas, a French colony where the line between slavery and freedom was more blurred than in the rest of the Caribbean. Sarah arrived on an island where thousands of freed Africans, known as gens de couleur, had built thriving communities, and where her story of revenge would be greeted not with horror, but with admiration. During her first months in Saint-Domingue, Sarah established herself as an independent trader, using the stolen Whitmore's gold and valuable information about trade routes she had memorized over the years. But more importantly, she began to use her experience to help other fugitive slaves who were constantly arriving from all the English colonies in the Caribbean. The story of the woman who had burned the masters spread like wildfire throughout the Caribbean region. In Jamaica, Barbados, Virginia, and the smaller colonies, slaves whispered the name of Sarah of Charleston with almost religious reverence. Her revenge had shown that the masters were not invincible, that justice could be carried out by African hands. The English authorities never ceased searching for her. For 5 years, they offered rewards that reached up to £500 sterling for her capture, a sum equivalent to the price of 50 slaves. But Sarah had disappeared as effectively as if the earth had swallowed her up. In Saint-Domingue, Sarah established what historians would call the Avengers Network, a clandestine system that aided fugitive slaves, provided information on cruel masters, and occasionally executed selective revenge against the most brutal slave traders. Her method had become an inspiration to an entire generation of rebels. Sarah lived 23 more years as a free woman. She never remarried or had more children, considering that her maternal heart had died with Kwame and Kofi. Instead, she informally adopted dozens of orphaned slave children, becoming the mother of an entire community of free Africans. In 1712, at age 51, Sarah died peacefully in her home in Port-au-Prince, surrounded by the hundreds of people whose lives she had saved during her years of freedom. Her last words, according to witnesses present, were, "Kwame, Kofi Mama is coming. The debt is paid." The story of Sarah of Charleston transcended her time and became a founding legend of slave resistance in the Americas. Her vengeance directly inspired the great uprisings that followed: the Haitian Revolution of 1791, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia, Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy, and the Maroon communities that endured for centuries throughout the American South. The method Sarah developed, domestic infiltration, the use of intimate knowledge of the enemy, and the execution of poetic justice, became the unwritten manual of slave resistance throughout the Americas. In Charleston, the Whitmore House was demolished by order of the colonial governor, who considered it a cursed place that inspired rebellion. But the ruins became a secret pilgrimage site for slaves seeking inspiration for their own struggles for freedom. More than 330 years later, the story of Sarah of Charleston confronts us with uncomfortable truths about justice, revenge, and the limits of human resistance. A mother who was robbed of everything she loved decided that she would not wait for divine or legal justice, but would take it into her own hands. Her legacy is not only that of an avenger, but that of a woman who showed that no system of oppression is invincible when those suffering under it decide they will tolerate no more humiliation. Sarah not only killed 4 men, she killed the idea that slaves were passive victims, incapable of defending themselves. The story of Sarah of Charleston lives on in every mother who protects her children, in every person who refuses to accept injustice, and in every human being who understands that dignity is not begged for, it is taken. If this story of resistance and maternal justice has touched you, please share it to honor the memory of Sarah and the millions of Africans who fought for their freedom in the Americas. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden truths of our colonial history. Do you know other stories of historical revenge that deserve to be told? Leave us your comments and become part of this community that rescues the silenced voices of the past.